Okay. Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. It is 7 o'clock. Um, ooh, just want to welcome everyone to our event this evening with Dr. Artress Bethany White. She is with us tonight to talk about her new essay collection, Survivor's Guilt. But before I officially introduce her, I wanted to welcome you. If you are not familiar with Bookmarks, we are a literary arts nonprofit, an independent bookstore located in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My name is Ashley Bryan. I'm the Youth and Schools Coordinator, and I'm thrilled to be here with everyone this evening. I did just a few housekeeping rules. Everyone is on mute. If you have a question during our event, please type it in the chat box that is to the right of your screen. We will take questions at the end of Dr. White's presentation. A reminder that even though we are virtual, this is still a safe space and our code of conduct does still apply. But otherwise, we will go ahead and get started. We have with us this evening, as I mentioned before, Dr. White. Artress Bethany White is a poet, essayist, and literary critic. She is the recipient of the Trio Award for her second poetry collection, My America. Survivor's Guilt, Essays on Rice and American Identity is her debut essay collection from New Rivers Press and is listed as a must-read on the Community of Literary Magazines and Press's Social Justice reading list. Her prose and poetry have appeared in journals such as the Harvard Review, Solstice, Poet Lore, Ecotone, Birmingham Poetry Review, Tupelo Quarterly, and the Hopkins Review. White has received fellowships and residencies from the Appalachian College Association, the Hambridge Center for Creative Arts, the Swanee Writers Conference, the Writers Hotel, and the Tupelo Press Studios. She is an associate professor of English at East Stroudsburg University and teaches poetry and nonfiction workshops for Rosemont College Summer Writers Retreat in Pennsylvania. She is also nonfiction editor for the Boston-based Literary Journal. So I'm going to pass this. That's quite an accomplished list. What a beautiful bio. But I'm going to pass this off to you and let you share your new essay collection with us. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Ashley. And I also want to say thank you to Jamie Rogers Southern, also of Bookmarks in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, for hosting this event. And I really appreciate you sharing the bio. Are you hearing feedback?
There's a little bit of feedback.
Okay. Okay. Is there I'm going to turn off my speaker and see what happens. Hold on one second. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Should I mute? Okay, how's this? Should I mute myself? Does that help? Can you still hear
Yes,
me?
that is much better. Yes.
All right, I'm just going to ask one more time. Can everyone hear me? And if someone could just type out the response, I'll know to keep it like this. Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I came to write Survivor's Guilt, Essays on Race and American Identity. For the past 10 years, I've faced the challenges of raising a transracial family in the South, delving more deeply into the history of my family's enslavement to one of the largest planter families in the US, and reckoned with the discovery of an ancestor being lynched by the KKK in the 19th century. I started going through this process while simultaneously experiencing, along with the rest of the nation, incidents of domestic violence in the US, domestic terrorism, and also police brutality against the Black and Brown community. And so I began to think about how this process of collective mourning around race-related issues was a national problem, and that the way to actually begin to deconstruct what was taking place is to recognize that really the answer has been with us all along. And that answer is social justice literacy. Basically, through story, becoming familiar with how race has impacted this nation from its very beginnings. So as a part of that process, when I began, along with the rest of the nation, to think about such events as the shooting deaths of 9 members of the Mother Emanuel AME Church on June 17th, 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, the Pulse nightclub shooting on December 12th, 2016 in Orlando, Florida, which took the lives of 49 people, the shooting at an outdoor concert from the Mandalay Bay Hotel on October 1st, 2017 in Las Vegas, Nevada, which took the lives of 58 people. The Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting on February 14th, 2018 in Parkland, Florida, which took the lives of 17 people. The shooting of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on October 27th, 2018, which took the lives of 11 people. I was able, along with the rest of the nation, to see how markedly these events paralleled the racial discord in this nation. And I thought the same thing when, with the rest of the nation, I experienced the shooting of Trayvon Martin on February 26, 2012 in Sanford, Florida, Tamir Rice on November 22nd, 2014 in Cleveland, Ohio, the death of Sandra Bland while in police custody on July 13th, 2015 in Waller County, Texas, that we had a serious problem on our hands. So the question emerged, how do we actually begin to affect change in this nation? So in Survivor's Guilt, I present a series of personal essays as political commentary on the state of our nation. While the list of names comprising fallen victims continues to grow, I implore readers not to forget the terrorism that once enabled segregation and racial violence at the hands of supremacist groups and has now reemerged in the guise of racial bias, homophobic politics, anti-immigration sentiment. And wonder, could true understanding be only a shared story away? I'm a firm believer in the fact that story finds us, And that certainly is what happened to me. While I do spend quite a bit of time writing about my immediate family and what it was like being in an interracial marriage and raising a transracial family in the South, and I do that in some detail, I also find myself thinking about the story that I inherited from my mother when I was a child about the history of my family's enslavement. And there is a constant relationship between the personal and the public when we talk about race relations, because so many people have had their personal experiences and have personal stories to share, while simultaneously we're dealing with a national history that demands we actually know the facts about racial discord in this country. So I'm going to begin with an anecdote of something that happened to me when I was in middle school. And this occurred on the one day, and this, I believe it happened in seventh grade. On the one day the teacher talked about slavery over the course of the school year. Yes, it was one day. And a young man walked over to the globe in the classroom, and he spun it around and found the continent of Africa, pointed to the country of Niger, and pronounced it like the racial slur and said, "Oh, this is inward. You know what? You should go back there." And because we had never studied the continent, we had never gone through the process of naming countries, I had no way to respond and say that's the incorrect pronunciation of that country, even though I knew that it could not be a racial slur. And I knew intuitively that this was not so. I didn't have the information to back up what was in my heart. But in that moment, I recognized that I had a different history that had already been handed to me by my mother about my enslavement in America, and how that my American identity was tied to the building up of this nation. But these were things that the teacher in the classroom never said anything about. So along with the dismay in my heart about that comment was also the firm belief that I had a history that he knew nothing about, but that history made me an American. So I'm just going to read a part of the chapter that delves more deeply into the history that I inherited from my mother. As a kid, I recall my father's emphatic words, "Your mother is not white." After almost hitting the brakes in the middle of the highway, following my offhand comment about my mother's race. Offering proof, he explained that both of my maternal grandparents were Black, which made her also Black, despite her red hair and freckles, which seemed to state otherwise. Corrected, I stared out the window of the moving car, marveling that I had spent nearly the first decade of my life believing my mother was white because of her fair skin, hair that did not kink, a face full of lentigens, and feet that were the same color on top as they were on the bottom. Realistically, I should not have been blamed for misreading my gene pool as a kid. After all, my parents had separated during my infancy, and my father had always been my custodial parent. I could count on one hand the number of times I visited my birth mother before graduating high school. Still, I had accepted in my child's mind that my mother was white, and it certainly didn't change the fact that she was my mother, despite my own deeper brown complexion. I guess you could say I forgave her for not looking more like me, which meant I forgave her for her skin color, the exact shade of dry sand on an expanse of sun-kissed beach. Color was the obvious difference between this mother and daughter, but while gazing into my bathroom mirror one day, I spied a distinctive sprinkle of freckles across my nose. This single shared trait kept everything, blood, simple. To explain my maternal line of tangled blood ties, my mother passed along her knowledge of a Scottish ancestor named Peter Harriston and a rough date of his landing in British America in the early 1700s. She explained that members of our family were enslaved by the Harristons and over time became related to them. During this conversation, she also told me about my great-grandfather and the significance of his middle name, Gilchrist. According to my mother, the name had been passed down in her family for generations. To maintain the tradition, she ensured that my younger brother would also bear the middle name of Gilchrist for a new generation. Learning about my interracial ancestry in North Carolina as a child was a novel experience and gave me a different vision of my heritage beyond the bowels of a slave ship. Yes, my African ancestors experienced the Middle Passage and proved their resilience by living to see a distant American shore. But they had also become part of the American dream of an immigrant family from Scotland. The two lines, black and white, built an enduring plantation empire spanning Virginia, North Carolina, and Mississippi. I could claim the name, the history, and the blood, sweat, and tears of both sides. This oral slave narrative was the explanation for her fair skin and freckles, determined Scottish genes on an otherwise African tapestry. My family history was truly the stuff of a mixed blood American reality. I would later learn that a white member of the Harrison family fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. This is not surprising, considering that a single member of the same family had once owned several thousand slaves, and the calculated holdings of the entire family over the course of institutional slavery in the United States was, by one estimate, 10,000 slaves. In 1989 New York Times article, I read the story of how the Harrison family reunion, founded by my Black great-grandfather, William G. Harrison, became a modern-day white and Black affair, seeking to erase the barriers erected by that same Civil War. While white family descendants may still reside on plantation lands, there is also a Black family parallel history. This history is recalled in the pride I felt after visiting the one-room Pine Hall colored school, now a deteriorating local historic landmark on a North Carolina mountaintop. Here, my maternal great-grandfather, William G., instructed his classes in the early 20th century, and in the same region left many acres of land to his own Black children. In his book, The Kulimi Plantation and Its People, the namesake and great-grandson of Civil War era Peter Harrison includes an index listing the names and birth dates of the enslaved from his branch of the Harrison family. The names of many of my ancestors are on this list. Using the details from the oral slave narrative I inherited from my mother, the Kulimi plantation records, and vital statistic records, I was able to put together a narrative of my great-grandfather's birth, marriage, and creation of a family of his own. Born on a plantation in 1865, evidence supports William G. being conceived by his enslaved mother, Mima, who was still listed as Peter Hairston's plantation property for that year, and her master. Additionally, her newly born son, Gilchrist, also spelled an untraditional spelling, Gilchrist, was listed as her progeny with an 1865 birth date in the same documentation. The name Gilchrist resonated strongly for me as I looked through these slave records because part of the oral slave narrative that was passed down to me by my mother centered on the importance of William G's middle name, not his first name. This significant middle name is how he is listed on plantation records connecting him to his mother. Later, I would find other public records that tied mother and son together by name. These records would include William G's 1891 marriage license, documenting the beginning of his family life with my great-grandmother, Sally Fulton. On this documentation, he lists Mima as his mother and Peter Hairston as his father. Another aspect of my mother's oral slave narrative claimed that my great-grandfather was a blood descendant of the original Peter Hairston who immigrated from Scotland and his subsequent descendants. On a post-emancipation census, Mima is listed as mulatto. It would stand to reason that she was also a descendant of white Hairstons. If indeed his master was his father, this made William G. a quadroon in the racial parlance of slavery, meaning that he was only 1/4 African American. William G. was conceived on the eve of slavery's demise in the South. His mother, Mima, was a 14-year-old slave girl in 1864 when she realized that she would become a mother. Her life, like the lives of many of the enslaved, had not yet changed, despite Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which legislatively ended the institution of slavery. This legislation, however, did not guarantee that every slave was in a position to or allowed to walk away from enslavement without the direct support of the Union Army. So as a part of going through these records, I recognize the recurrence of certain names from the original white Hairston that my family is descended from. And the repetition of names indicated that the enslaved themselves were paying attention to these relationships and wanted to ensure that the same members of the family would not associate with each other intimately as adults. It was a way of protecting their gene pool as well as recording history about their lives in relationship to the planter family. So through that recognition, I determined that there are direct connections to the Hairston family going back as far as my 7 times great-grandmother in 1770. So this is the record I was able to trace fairly consistently and would follow and fall in line with the oral slave narrative that I inherited from my mother. And just to talk about the power of that oral narrative, I've already given the rationale for why I decided to write this collection of essays, but the essays where I talk specifically about my family, the one I just read from, came about because I found myself telling my blood-related daughter, because I have a blended family now through marriage, telling my blood-related daughter this story about her family history and explaining it all to her. And one day I just said, why am I telling her this story orally again to pass down to her daughter when I need to share this story for several reasons? To make sure that, yes, the members of our family have access to this data for future generations, but so that also a nation that has had so much difficulty dealing with slave history will recognize how my story is also the story of many other African Americans who may not be able to so clearly document their family ancestry, that when they look at a Black person and determine that they are Black, they also carry a large portion of European blood in their veins. As part of this process, I did a DNA test and found out that I could directly trace 25% of my DNA to the British Isles, right? So that when we talk about being a melting pot in America, the institution of slavery made sure that that was a very accurate description of our population. And that until we actually deal with, the way that race as a social construct has made us think about blood relationship and DNA, that we cannot really begin the process of dismantling racist ideology in this country. Now, it's one thing to understand it on an intellectual level and walk away from it, but when we actually began to read a canon that points to this again and again, from the 19th century and, well, actually I should say the 18th century to the present in America, and study those texts as a nation, not just select portions of the population in higher education, but as a nation, that we will not really begin to act upon the truth of that history. So beyond this process of tracing my own family line and having those watershed moments of, how this history was so protected through oral narrative, I also came in direct contact with the post-Reconstruction narrative of violence against the African American community. And this was through the ritual enactment of lynching. In reading one of the books that was written about my family, because certainly I'm not the first person to write about the Hairston family, I came across one brief mention of a Black Hairston who was lynched in 1891, and the belief that the author that this was a member of my family. One of the things about the Hairston name, because there are a lot of African Americans as well as white Harrisons who carry the name, is that after emancipation, many of the enslaved took on the last names of their enslavers. And so, the fact that they carried the last name did not necessarily point to close family ties. But in other ways, it did. And what I mean by that is that even though there were a percentage of African Americans on the plantation who carried white Hairston blood, there were other families constructed by the enslaved themselves who had a relationship with each other. And so they were family in post-emancipation America based on slave marriages, slave relationships, right, on the same plantation. So in the way the Hairstons talk about it, because I have attended Hairston family reunions, is that everyone who's a Hairston is related somewhere down the line. And in some ways, there is a lot of truth to that, right? And, along with that are the families who were closer to the planter family themselves, right? So this gets me back to the story that I want to share about Estes Hairston and his lynching in 1881. What I decided to do was follow up on that one-line mention in the book written by Henry Weincheck, The Hairstons in Black and White. And I found a series of articles that detailed the events around the lynching And I'd like to say too that, as a specialist in African American literature, I was able to immediately discern a lot of things from these newspaper articles. As someone who had, spent time with Ida B. Wells' publications on the status of lynching in America at the end of the 19th century, and other writers who dealt with the issue in nonfiction and fiction. On the day that I find out that an African American Harrison was lynched by 150 white men, one thought is uppermost in my mind. To the man who took the time to count the perpetrators, I would first like to say thank you for being so thorough. And I hope that at some point in the years after the lynching, you thought about other things you might have done in those long moments before two Black men were hanged from a tree before your eyes, and those of the other masked members of the Ku Klux Klan. It was while reading The Harrisons, An American Family in Black and White, that I found out about the author's belief that one of my ancestors was lynched in 1881. The book traces the slave-owning history of the white Harrisons and the African Americans that they enslaved over the course of their participation in the United States slave trade. I know the history of racial violence in America, and lynch law is an important part of that history. So why was I so galvanized by news of a once enslaved ancestor being touched intimately by this very same history? Perhaps it was because of my own recent 21st century involvement with Klan semiotics. There was the incident the previous spring semester when, while teaching in a college classroom in the South, I'd been forced to request that security excuse a student from the room for exhibiting the Confederate flag during class after I'd asked him to put it away, and he'd refused. As he was walked out of the classroom and down the hall, he continued to explain that he was not a racist. I tried not to hear security responding, we know, convincing myself that they were just trying to talk him down and that I should not read it as their weighing in with an opinion on the issue. There was also the incident that had taken place the previous summer. I'd been invited to attend a tour of a Confederate cemetery on another college campus. I politely declined and was left wondering why anyone might imagine that a Black woman would want to walk among the tombstones of people who fought a war to keep her ancestors enslaved. The Ku Klux Klan was established by ex-Confederate soldiers who needed to change their tactics for subjugating Blacks after the Civil War did not result in secession from the Union. These disgruntled rebel soldiers continued to wage their own war beneath the hood and under the banner of the Confederate flag. When I see a Confederate flag today, that's the heritage I see being claimed and celebrated. So after learning about the Estes Harrison lynching, it was not like looking back through history. It was more like looking across at a parallel history that continues to unfold upon the foundation of those Confederate stars and bars. The inconsistent facts around Estes and Lindsay's lynching could easily be seen in the reported victims, and the fact that the facts kept changing. In certain articles, the women that were supposedly raped were grown women. In others, they were young girls. The facts were never consistent. The men themselves were held in prison for 7 months, ostensibly so that they could be kept alive for a fair trial, which never took place because a mob broke them out of prison, which was not unusual during this time period. In fact, one judge in one of the articles I came across said that he would not even try to prosecute the people who were part of the mob that had, had broken men out of prison in order to be lynched, because it would be a pointless endeavor to do so. And, whether they were being kept for a fair trial or being kept so that they would not be killed, the fact remains that eventually they were hanged for a crime that it was very unlikely they had committed at all. During this time frame, lynching was used as a means of intimidation, as a means of controlling Black life after slavery, because white males were not willing to give autonomy to Black men or Black people at large. And so this was a way of making sure that Blacks, quote, stayed in their place. And so the inconsistency, like I said, around the details of the case, the fact that suddenly one of the women who was supposedly raped disappeared and the child who was raped died, was used as a rationale behind justifying what actually was carried out during the course of that lynching and in the aftermath, so that the perpetrators, were never brought to justice. So, as a part of this history, I see it certainly being closely tied to the history of enslavement, to the means of controlling Black life that was carried out well into the 20th century. Stories of white Harrisons and Black Harrisons continuing to be involved with each other in the region that I talk about in various ways. And as far as how this becomes part of the national narrative, historically, it's a part of that narrative, but how different is the lynching that is described of Estes Harrison and Lindsay, the man who was with them, from the lynching that we were all privy to through the death of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, where he was deliberately cornered by a white father and son and a third party whose ego encouraged him to actually film the event so that we could all watch the injustice of it again and again on social media. How different is it from that situation? One of the things that I was able to do after writing this essay was actually to visit the social justice memorial, the Peace and Justice Memorial in Alabama, that is informally referred to as the Lynching Memorial. And before I was able to visit it, I was concerned that maybe Estes Harrison and the gentleman who's with him, Lindsay, were not recognized as a part of that memorial. And, when I visited, I felt, I don't want to say, the feeling was really one of gratefulness, I guess, that they had not been left off of the roster of more than 4,000 lynchings that have taken place in America. And I sat for a while and just meditated, on their names and their position in history, and the fact that so many would pass through the gates of that memorial and would, come across their names and understand that, their lives were taken from them during an era where, when a Black man was accused of something, there was very little chance that he would be able to walk away with his life after that accusation. And the rape of a white woman was one of those accusations that a lot of Black men did not walk away from. And it certainly wasn't the only reason that Black men were lynched. They were also lynched for registering to vote or trying to vote, right, which was a part of their civil rights, which they gained after emancipation. So the history that we are confronted with on a regular basis through race relations in this country comes up again and again. And it never ceases to amaze me, even though my book came out just this past April, the number of people who are, well past grown, who tell me that they never encountered this information in a classroom anywhere. And this goes back to social justice literacy, which is what I refer to again and again throughout these essays. As I mentioned, books that people can read to find out more about these histories, and the necessity of actually doing that legwork and reading. People ask me all the time, are there books that I can read that talk about the racial injustices in this country? And while we're going through a moment right now where certain titles might quickly come to mind because they've been publicized so much, this cannot be a trend. This is an educational overhaul that has to take place across the nation. And in my collection of essays, I even talk about books for young people because my husband and I were volunteer readers in the public school system, and we would read to our youngest daughter's elementary class, and we'd be very careful about the books that we brought into the classroom. And these were books that we knew the teacher was not exposing the students to, that talk about these histories in terms that young people can understand, because the violent politics of race are played out in the elementary playground. Our youngest daughter had to face being called the N-word, being called, out of her name, out of her race already before she left the 5th grade. And the young people who were doing this were doing so because they had no grounding or education in racial violence in this country. What they were picking up about racial hierarchies, they were getting from their parents. And the public service of the public educational system is to basically level the playing field and give every individual in this nation the tools they need to navigate life and to navigate that life around people who don't necessarily look like them. And it's a failure of the public school system that it's not happening. So, just to wrap things up as far as, my collection of essays, my own journey through delving deep into my family's history in America. This is something that we have to do as a nation. For centuries, and the passing down of my own family's oral slave narrative proves this, race in this country has been a Black and brown problem. But really, it is a problem for all of us. And without sharing that story broadly, it won't change. And without non-Black folk taking upon themselves to read this story along with people of color, the change will not be lasting. So thank you very much, and I'm interested in fielding some questions.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Can you hear me? Hold on. Okay, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. The first one that we have is, how unusual is it for African Americans to know their history?
Which one?
Did you hear me?
Oh, okay, hold on one second. Okay, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. How unusual is it for African Americans to know their heritage?
How unusual is it for African Americans to know
Their heritage.
Their heritage? How unusual is it for African American young people to know their heritage? I'd say I've been an educator in higher education for more than 2 decades. And I'd say that it is still not unusual for me to get students as freshmen who have not read a book by an African American writer. I kid you not. And while what I have found though is students in honors classes have often had the experience, but it may have just been a segment of a slave narrative. So this is still not uncommon. I know that there are school systems where it happens more frequently, but you know, in teaching at the institutions where I attended, for example, University Kentucky, New York University, and Albright College. These are some of the schools I've taught at. It's still inconsistent. So it's not happening as broadly as people think.
Thank you. There's still a little bit of feedback coming from somewhere. Oh, now it stopped. Okay. Can you hear me?
Not really.
Okay. The next question is, how did your daughter respond to your sharing of her family history?
My daughter, my blood related daughter, how did she respond?
Yeah.
Okay. She was very interested in hearing about it. You know, I had given her books by some African American authors while she was young, and so she had some understanding of this history. And it's also in some school systems being talked about, like just say, for example, the issue of slavery. It's been talked about a little better than it had been in previous decades. But a part of her had some difficulty understanding the deeper aspects of it just because she had not been exposed to that information in such a detailed way.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Do we have any other questions? We have someone that wants to know if you have been to Kulimi.
So my plan was to visit, and then the pandemic came up. So I have not yet. I was going through an agenda I had put together for myself of various plantations to visit, and while some of those sites have been, I visited some of those sites already according to plan. That is one that I have not visited yet. Looking forward to it though.
Another viewer has said, I think it's fascinating to learn about various reparations that have been made over U.S. history to Native Americans and Japanese. Do you believe we might see reparations for African Americans?
You know, it's up for grabs how those reparations might be made, but I think some things will take place in the, you know, under the umbrella of reparations. Right?
What do you imagine those reparations could look like?
What do I imagine they'll look like? Oh boy, I know ones that I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see economic marginalization in urban Black communities cease. And I think a part of that would be through scholarships to various institutions so that the cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement could end, so that we can really get to what equity looks like in this country.
Can you compare how racial issues are approached in North Carolina in the 60s compared to today?
Can you compare how racial issues are approached compared to today? And wow. I mean, okay. Let me say that, I have family members in North Carolina, but I did not grow up in North Carolina. I grew up in Massachusetts, spent a decade living in Tennessee, and also spent a certain amount of time in Kentucky. So, my formative years, I was living in the Northeast. I have a very different attitude about the South than people who actually grew up in the South. And I mean, I think this is the thing I found is that Black people have a different experience in the South than white Southerners. And so that when I talk about the South and I talk about racial oppression, I'm talking about a white South not recognizing that people are still having these experiences. The Black people in the South and spending time within the African American community basically experience the South in a bubble, in the sense that it's their immediate families, their churches that help them survive this oppression. And that continues to this day. We still have racially exclusive churches in the South and in the Northeast for that matter, where a lot of that healing from trauma that happens in the outside world, is like, it's like, church as haven, place where you can go where people understand what you're going through, right? And so that people have found ways of surviving in this hostile environment. But what we see being played out nationally now, I see that as a national problem that crosses regional lines. So what happened in the 60s, for example, civil rights era, and, the legislation, the civil rights legislation that came from that, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, that legislation that healed the situation for the moment, right, we see being played out differently now. So you might think of, civil rights being a multi-part process. We first experienced it in Reconstruction, and then we experienced it in the Civil Rights era, and we experienced it again through affirmative action, and now we're experiencing it, to the point where we realize that these institutions that have perpetuated it for so many years must be dismantled, and there are various institutions that have come under fire that speak to that and the need for reform, right? So it's just another iteration of the civil rights eras, right? Is there another question?
Yeah, sorry. Was there any information you learned about your family history that impressed you? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at all?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Was there any specific information you learned about your family history that impressed you?
That impressed me? I mean, some of it I knew already, but I think the way my family was able to rebound from enslavement, that, even though my great-grandfather, was born in 1865 and recorded as being born on a plantation, he went on to become a landowner. He became educated and was able to teach in a colored schoolhouse generations of Black children. His own children went on to own home ownership, to make a living through the boarding house, system, make, a living off of that home ownership. They went on to become professional people in the medical profession, as school teachers, and just how it was such a limited amount of time that this change occurred, which just speaks to the resilience of African Americans after suffering such destitution as enslaved people, just being able to goal set and make their dreams come true, in large part, over the course of a generation, I think is incredible. And that's my family's story, and it's a beautiful story. But when have you been in a classroom and heard someone extol that particular story after enslavement?
Okay, our last question is, how do you believe we have moved ahead since the 60s?
Have we moved ahead? I don't think the question is necessarily have we moved ahead. I mean, certainly there are African Americans have moved into leadership positions, whether you're talking about in corporate and academia, with a number of African Americans holding PhDs. Certainly some inroads have been made, right? But a large segment of the population continues to be marginalized. So I think what we're seeing now, even in the midst of this pandemic, how essential workers have to face dire circumstances on a daily basis, while other members of the population are able to comfortably work at home and not put their lives on the line in the same way, is a level of elitism that we cannot accept as part and parcel of a democratic system. We should all be able to enjoy the fruits of safety, healthcare, and education. And until that happens, so that everyone has a chance to rise above the circumstances they may have been relegated to, then we're not really living in this nation and in the America that we all talk about living in. It can't just be for the few. It has to be for everybody. So no, we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, we have one more. The term constructive resilience in relation to African Americans has come up as a strength that may help all Americans can survive the worldwide issues that are coming at us. Can you comment?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Not sure I do either.
I think this is what I'll say, and I think this might get at what the person was trying to ask. And that is, does everyone have to bear the burden of this history? And I believe everyone in the nation does have to bear the burden of this history. Because when we bear it and act like we know it, act upon our knowledge instead of disregarding it, right? But acting upon it, then we'll actually get somewhere, right? So yes, this story is not just for a portion of the population. I wrote these essays for the whole population, right? It touches everyone's life.
Well, thank you so much for this and for sharing your story. We appreciate you joining us this evening. You absolutely have a beautiful gift with words. There's no doubt about that. If you have not already picked up a copy of Dr. White's book, we have it at the store. I am sharing the link to order in the chat box. I hope that you will all take a moment to appreciate these essays. If you read the book, please don't hesitate to share a review on your preferred platform for writing book reviews. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was, this was very informative. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You as well.